Hola a todos, bienvenidos a otro seminario conjunto con la Universidad de Chile y MIT. Hoy vamos a tener a Gita Gopina. El seminario va a ser en inglés y hay traducción simultánea para todos aquellos que tengan en Zoom. Busquen en la parte de abajo y escojan el lenguaje. Y también pueden verlo en YouTube y lo pueden escuchar en Radio Cooperativa en Chile. El seminario va a ser en inglés, así que de ahora en adelante vamos a switchar al inglés. Thank you everybody for joining us. It's a great pleasure to have Gita Gopina today with us. She will be introduced by Jose de Gregorio. I have known Gita when she was a student and in the job market, so it's a great pleasure to see how all her career has evolved to become the great economist that she is today. We will be chatting and the following are the rules. So Jose de Gregorio and I will actually pay attention to both the Q&A and the chat. So if you put questions in the chat that are in Spanish, don't worry, we can translate. And so we will be asking the questions to Gita as we go along. But please use the Q&A because it simplifies our life. You can actually write in Spanish in the Q&A and we will translate. For that, we will be here for 1 hour and we welcome everybody. So, Jose?
Yeah, hi. It is an honor and a great pleasure to have with us Gita Gopinath today. Gita Gopinath is the Economic Counselor and Director of the Research Department of the International Monetary Fund. She is on leave of public service from the University of Harvard Economics Department, where she is the John Swanstrap Professor of International Studies and of Economics. Gita is one of the most prolific and influential researchers today on international finance and macroeconomics. She has been published in many top economic journals. She has authored numerous research articles on exchange rates, trade and investment, international financial crisis, monetary policy, debt, and emerging market crisis. Recently, she has done superb research on international pricing and exchange rate adjustment. That's changing our way to see exchange rate regimes, and international adjustment. Gita is also an elected fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Science and of the Econometric Society. She's recipient of the Distinguished Alumnus Award from the University of Washington. In 2019, Foreign Policy named her one of the top global thinkers. In 2014, she was named one of the top 25 economists under 45 by the IMF. And in 2011, she was chosen the Young Global Leader by the World Economic Forum. So she has a very distinguished career. And today is a very timely moment. Since just a few days ago, the IMF released the World Economic Outlook, and we'll hear directly from Gita, the responsible for this, about the World Outlook. So please, Gita, the floor is yours. Great to see you.
Thank you so much, Jose, and thank you, Roberto, for inviting me to do this. It's a real pleasure. And like you said, we just put out our World Economic Outlook, so I'm happy to have the opportunity to disseminate that information on a much more broader basis. So I will present some slides. I'm going to start with sharing my screen, but then I also look forward to your questions. I just want to make sure that I have the screen sharing ability here. I do have that, but 1 second.
Yes.
Again.
The green button in the middle, Gita?
Yep.
Yeah.
No, I've done plenty of these, yes. Yep, okay, good. So I suppose you can see this, and I'm going to go into full screen mode.
Yeah, we can see perfectly.
All right, excellent. So yes, I'm going to describe the outlook for the world economy. And as we described it as long, uneven, and uncertain. So let me as I walk through the slides, I will explain some more about why we think of this as long, uneven, and uncertain. I will spend some time talking about emerging markets, especially also, and the Latin America region. Okay, so to start with, nobody has forgotten this, but this is first and foremost a pandemic-driven crisis. It's a health crisis. And so when we're looking at the outlook and where the world economy is headed, we start with chart graphs of this kind. So what you see, for instance, on the left graph is clearly the measured cases that we have around the world are continuing to rise. If you look at advanced economies, the second waves, third waves coming around. That's a green line. Emerging markets, you also had a big increase in the number of cases, but again, it varied across emerging markets. So relative to advanced economies, per million populations were smaller. And low-income countries in measured cases were one of the smallest overall. But every country is being hit by this. Now, despite the resurgence of the virus in second and third waves, if you look at the middle graph, you see that new deaths are well below their peaks in the spring. So well below. So you see some uptick most recently in the data, but nowhere near the peaks that we saw, which is a combination of factors. One, that the number of new cases we're measuring is because we're better at measuring them. There's a lot more testing going on. But second, there's also been huge improvements in the knowledge of how to treat this disease. And that has also helped with reduced fatality rates. And also the demographics of the population who are adding to these rising numbers include much more younger population, which are less vulnerable to this disease. So the world is learning to live with the virus, but it's not great living because, as you see from the right graph, because of the resurgence of the virus, reopenings have stalled and in some cases reversed. You saw recent announcements that came out of France and Germany, France going into a second national lockdown. Mobility commensurately, which was recovering quite sharply in April and May and June, have begun to stall. So that's the first piece of that, was the fact that the long part basically captures the fact that crisis is not over until we have a way of either living much better with the virus or actually having a vaccine that can prevent people from falling sick in the first place. What you see on this slide is what you would expect of what a recovery might look like when you are recovering from a crisis that's driven by health shocks. So you have seen improvements in manufacturing. You can see that in the left graph, and in services, you're seeing manufacturing improvements starting in June, particularly. But what the middle and the right graph shows you is that while manufacturing continues to recover, even though at maybe in somewhat slower pace in some parts of the world, but services, on the other hand, you are seeing either a stalling in the services recovery or some reversal too, which captures the fact that contact-intensive services are being hit much harder by the fact that this is the health crisis. And that's showing up, especially in countries where you're seeing a resurgence of the virus. So this is the uneven nature of the recovery within countries and across countries. Similarly, while you are seeing a sharp improvement in business sentiment, consumer sentiment has improved, but it's still globally, on a global average level, it still remains well below pre-pandemic levels. And again, what you see here in terms of global trade, you again see this distinction that while goods trade, which is the middle graph, rebounded from its collapse in April, though it's certainly not fully recovered, and we are still projecting growth to be trade to fall by 10% this year. But if you look at the services graph, which is the trade and services, which includes tourism and travel, you can see that that remains depressed and much, much weaker signs of recovery over there. Again, here, the uneven recovery. So what does this translate into? What it translates into is, if you look at, again at the left graph, the countries that rely more heavily on travel and tourism have experienced, for instance, bigger hits to their GDP in the first half of this year. What the middle graph shows you is that countries that had more stringent lockdowns also have had bigger revisions to their growth numbers in the first half of this year. Now, of course, this is a correlation and not a causal story. So we've actually done analytical work to, as best possible, tell apart how much of this is the lockdown itself, or how much of it comes from the fact that when people have to live with the virus, they voluntarily social distance. And the answer is that on average, it's about 50-50. Now, in emerging markets, the lockdowns have a more independent effect than voluntary social distancing does, as opposed to the other kind of flipped around in advanced economies. But the point is that even if you have reopenings, as long as there is no durable solution to living with the virus, then that's going to dampen the speed of the recovery, which is, again, the reason why this can take time. So labor market conditions tell a very similar story. You had everything plummet in the first half of the year, and then you've had a rebound in the second half. But again, the numbers have all ended up below the pre-pandemic level, and there's still a long way to go in terms of employment going back up to pre-pandemic levels and labor force participation rates going up and hours worked going up. Now, at the same time, while the labor market news is bad, the other troubling aspect is the polarization that you're seeing in the labor market, the increasing polarization that you're seeing. So what the left graph shows you is that people with lower levels of skills, education, have experienced higher increases in unemployment rates. So they're just being hit much harder. There, of course, are really good reasons for this. One is because they tend to be more heavily employed in contact-intensive sectors. And secondly, it's just very hard to do a bunch of activity remotely, except when these are very, very high-skilled jobs. And again, they're getting hit badly by that. What the middle graph shows you is the differential impact on men versus women that this crisis is bringing around. We have, this, when you look at what happens around the announcement of stay-at-home orders, or the announcements particularly of school closures, you find that women have been somewhat more affected than men. And the reason is because of the fact that it's still very much the case that women are the primary child caregivers at home. And so they're being more harder hit by this crisis. Now, of course, the question for everybody looking forward is that we're seeing transformations, we're seeing sectors shrinking. Where will all the jobs come back from, right? And the right graph is a concerning picture, because what it shows you, this is data specifically for the US, you see big collapses in jobs in terms of employment in sectors like leisure and hospitality, which have been very hard hit. But then you have sectors that internet related, which is like e-commerce, warehousing, where they've benefited in this crisis. But if you look at the number of new jobs that they're creating, there's, it pales in comparison to the jobs that are being lost. So this is a question that will have to come up going forward about how do we come out of a crisis like this and at the same time have enough jobs, productive jobs. A variable that everybody was very concerned about was what would happen to inflation, right? This is both a crisis that has a supply shock component, because you're basically shutting down production. At the same time, it's also a demand shock component, because people are told to stay home and not go out to restaurants and spend. And people are also choosing to do that. So the question is, which effect would dominate? What you see on the left graph here is that food price inflation did go up. It's volatile at this point, but consistent with the fact that there was a supply shock and the demand for food stayed high. Food prices have remained somewhat elevated. They've come down in advanced economies. But if you look at the middle graph, which is consumer price inflation, and especially core consumer price inflation, which excludes food and commodities and volatile products like that, you see that this overall, pretty much across the board, with few exceptions. There are exceptions, but those are few. You're seeing a decline in inflation, in core inflation, in the emerging markets as a group and in advanced economies as a group. Now, why is headline inflation coming down everywhere? And it's also a reflection of the fact that we have commodity prices, especially oil prices, that while they rebounded from the depth of their collapse, they're still well below pre-pandemic levels. They're about a third below pre-pandemic levels. While on the other hand, some other commodities like metals, for instance, have recovered quite strongly, partly because of the rebound in growth in stronger recovery coming out of China. Okay, so while that's the the situation that we've seen in terms of the indicators in terms of employment and inflation and manufacturing and services, what we have to recognize is that all of this has taken place in an environment with tremendous policy support. So policy easing, both monetary policy and fiscal policy, have played a really essential role in preventing a collapse, further collapse, and in helping with the recovery. For example, because of the very large amounts of monetary easing, large asset purchases, large liquidity injections were made to central banks around the world, we don't have a financial crisis, despite having one of the worst recessions, I would say, since the Great Depression. And you do see that portfolio flows that were leaving in large numbers in March, at least that has stabilized and returned to several emerging markets. But there is a distinction. So if you look at the middle graph, you see that if you're in an emerging market that was viewed as investment grade, then the spreads have come down quite dramatically after going back up. On the other hand, if you're a non-investment grade country or a liquor frontier market, non-investment grade market, then yes, you've had spreads come down, but you're still you still have significant spreads compared to pre-pandemic levels. And for example, if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, there, since February of this year, they haven't been able to issue even $1 of debt. So these are markets that are highly constrained. What the right graph shows you is the currency movements. And currency movements have had a very mixed picture, which is in March, many countries' currencies depreciated dramatically. Then over the summer, it looked like there were appreciations happening, and especially you saw that for commodity exporters. You saw, for instance, Colombia, you can see that prices go back up. But, sorry, the currency appreciates. But now recently, you're again seeing, a trend towards currency depreciations in some parts of the world. So I would say it's a bit of a mixed picture at this point. Fiscal policy played a very essential role. $12 trillion was deployed globally to help households, to help firms, to help all these different sectors that were hard hit. But as you can see from the left graph, that's disproportionately been done by advanced economies. Advanced economies deployed about 20% of their GDP, both above and below the line, in fiscal support measures. If you look at the emerging market group, that number is around 6% of their GDP. And if you look at low-income countries, that is 2% of GDP. So you can clearly see that emerging and developing economies were more constrained in how they could spend and respond to this crisis as compared to the advanced economies. Now, what we are, of course, what people are talking about COVID fatigue, there is also big concerns of whether they're, of fiscal fatigue. In some sense, a lot has been deployed, but the crisis is not over. If you look at the right graph, you see, for instance, the duration of income support measures by country. Some countries have already announced that they're going to extend the duration of those measures into next year. Several, those measures have already ended or are projected to fade out. So there is some concern about these policy cliffs going forward. Our recommendation is that countries that have the space, and we believe several advanced economies especially do, and some emerging markets do, that it is important not to prematurely withdraw support, be it monetary policy or fiscal policy. But these kinds of income support measures would be really important, need to continue. So here is a more kind of zeroing in on emerging markets and also seeing what's happening in terms of monetary policy rates. So if you look at the left graph, what you can see is that now, with the large amounts of monetary easing, that the fraction of advanced economies whose interest rates are less than 1% have gone up from under 60% to now close to 90%. So if ever there was a global liquidity trap, this is becoming more and more one of those. And the right bars show you the same for emerging markets, that now we have over 20% of emerging markets whose policy rates are under 1%. The right graph shows you the discretionary fiscal responses to the COVID-19 crisis. The red bars are, what we call below the line measures, which is not direct spending, but like equities, loans, guarantees. The blue lines are additional spending and foregone revenue. And what you see is there's quite a bit of variation across countries, even among the emerging market bundle. You can see, for instance, Brazil and Chile, if you look at the combined spending, are on the higher end of it, while Mexico is on the most conservative end in the spectrum. So there is a large amount of variation in how countries have responded to this crisis. So for Latin American economies, again, I've zeroed in from all emerging markets to Latin American economies here. On the left graph, you can see again the size of the spending as a percentage of GDP. I have a line at the 20%, which just reminds you where advanced economies are. And then I have a line for emerging markets, which reminds you where the average for emerging markets are. And as you can see, there are some countries, again, Brazil, Chile, which have Peru, which have had significant spending above the emerging market average, while you have many others which are below that average. Now, this is a crisis that calls for the kind of spending that has been deployed, and with the pandemic still with us, there's going to be a demand for these kinds of resources and spending. But of course, the middle picture tells you what is happening globally, but this is now focused on Latin American economies in terms of debt to GDP. So this is going to be debt to GDPs of record levels. For the globe as a whole, we're reaching 100% of GDP for global debt to GDP, which is a record. It even surpasses World War II highs. And so you have this projected increase in debt. So that is, I think, the challenge that's facing policymakers in the region, which is that the crisis is not over. There is still need to provide support, but there is clearly this specter of very high levels of debt coming out of the crisis. And because of that, you see on the right graph, there is a push to, so what the right graph basically shows you is the impulse, fiscal impulse to growth coming from, these kinds of discretionary spending. And you can see that it's very positive. The red lines tell you that these are very positive growth contributions to growth in 2020, but the green line shows you that this is, that will be withdrawn because of the fact that discretionary measures are expected to be, removed in 2021 as governments try to move back towards their debt rules. So I think this is the challenge because there is this risk of premature withdrawal that could harm the recovery. But at the same time, you have to keep in mind that debt is growing up. So the ideal strategy, of course, would be to have a medium-term fiscal framework to anchor expectations. You would need to have structural fiscal reforms that are communicated well, that take place over the medium term to, again, provide confidence that debt will remain sustainable, while in the near term, you do more kind of targeted, essential policy support. Okay, so now I'm going to show you some numbers very quickly. I'm going to skip the assumptions. If somebody wants to ask me about the assumptions, I'm happy to talk about this, but this is what we have. These are our growth projections. The global economy is projected to shrink by 4.4% in 2020, and then rebound to 5.2% in 2021. Advanced economies as a group fall by 5.8% this year, and then rebound only partially to 3.9%. You can see the fact that going by the first row, that pretty much all parts of the world in the advanced economy group, you have recessions, and record in deep recessions in many countries. If emerging markets and low-income countries, you have their growth projected to be minus 3.3% this year, and then rebound to 6% next year. But an important part of that rebound, and I'm going to go into that in my next few slides, really comes from China. So you can see China is projected to already do better than 2019 levels in 2020, 1.9%, and then 8.2% next year. While you have many other large emerging markets, India, Brazil, Russia, which are projected to be in recession this year, and then only partially recover next year. Here are the projections for the Latin America region specifically. You can see that there's a very large overall deep, recessions. For emerging market and developing economies group, it's minus 3.3% as a whole, while for Latin America and the Caribbean region, it's minus 8.1%. Now, of course, one has to keep in mind that the pre-pandemic projected growth rate was also smaller for this region, but still the revisions are quite large. And again, very large negative growth rates. Okay, so this is a picture of how, again, we think of the recovery. This tells you the path of GDP from now until 2020, at the end of 2021. It's a path of real GDP. So the red line is a path of real GDP for China. The dashed lines are what we had projected pre-pandemic, and the solid lines are what we are projecting now. Right? So this is a comparison of what we had projected pre-pandemic relative to what we're projecting now. As you can see, China is quite an outlier. China has the classic V-shaped recovery with a return back and growth going forward. So it returns back very quickly. While as of now, our projections for the advanced economies and for emerging and developing economies, excluding China, is a much more slower recovery. That's the solid green line and the solid blue line. And another concerning trend, of course, is that we're seeing growing divergence across these groups, which means that if you look at advanced economies and you compare them to emerging and developing economies, excluding China, and you look at the loss in per capita income between this year, cumulatively over 2020 and 2021, it's a bigger hit to emerging and developing economies, excluding China, as compared to advanced economies. So this is prospects of convergence look bleak. And also for the first time, we put out our medium-term projections, which is projections into 2025. What the left graph shows you is how much, the blue line is what we projected cumulative growth would be between 2019 and 2025 before the pandemic. The red bars tell you what we are projecting now for that period. As you can see, that red bar is shorter than the blue bar everywhere. So, while it was not as if the prospects pre-pandemic for the global economy were that great, but they have deteriorated even compared to that scenario, which means it's a hit to living standards pretty much everywhere in the world. The right graph shows you the gap between what we projected GDP to be in 2024 for each of those regions relative to what we are projecting now. So it's basically where we thought those regions would be in 2024 in terms of overall GDP and what we are projecting it to be now, right? And as you can see, it's negative numbers across the board, which means that for all of these regions, we have a significant persistent gap in making up, in returning to the pre-pandemic projected path. But I also want to highlight that there is variation. For instance, Latin America and the Caribbean has the biggest gap. So in terms of the concerns about scarring and in terms of the lost medium-term output, we have a very large gap for the Latin America region. It's large in many other places, but it's particularly large. And also, by the way, I should be clear that there is heterogeneity within each of these groups. So it's not a blanket statement about all countries. Okay, so in my last few minutes, I'm just going to flag the risks. Okay, firstly, there can be an upside scenario. So before I start talking about the downside risk, there is an upside scenario where you have, much better outcomes in terms of treating the disease or in terms of preventing it. So a combination of better vaccines, of treatments, of better testing methodologies, all of that could happen, in which case we could have a much faster recovery relative to what we have in our projections. Secondly, there could be even more fiscal stimulus in the system than what we have in our system, because we don't include a fiscal stimulus unless it's actually been announced and we know what it is. But that could come around in some major economies, and that could also affect the forecast going forward. But on the other hand, there are many downside risks. So if I look at these graphs over here, what it basically tells you is that because of all the support that's been provided, you've not really seen much of an increase in bankruptcy filings. And you have seen jobs lost, but what this graph is telling you that it could be a whole lot more worse. If the support cannot be continued, if the crisis lasts much longer, you could have a much worse situation. Left graph shows you how financial markets have recovered strongly in some countries, but that could change. If there's worse news with respect to our ability of living with the virus, much more stringent lockdowns, then that can have a negative impact. This is in a time when trade restrictions, investment restrictions are going up around the world. That's the black line. And then the right graph is basically one of the important concerns we have, which is the implications of all of what we are seeing right now for fiscal vulnerabilities in terms of debt distress and so on. We had about half of the low-income countries were already in debt distress before entering this pandemic. They continue to be so. It's even a worse problem now. But we are seeing an increase in the number of emerging markets who are also now viewed as being in high to medium risks of debt distress. Again, it depends on what plays out. If the baseline plays out, we will not see major amounts of debt distress, but if it doesn't, things can change very quickly. Scarring comes from many fronts. Investment tends to be slow to recover, and that can have an effect on future physical capital. The middle graph shows you something unique about this crisis. So yes, there is always a hit to human capital that happens in a recession when people are out of jobs. But this time we have the direct effect that comes from school closures. And while there are parts of the world where distance learning works, there are the vast majority of the world, it doesn't. And that can have a big hit to human capital, and really remedial measures need to be taken there. And all of this is playing out in terms of really deeply disturbing increases in extreme poverty. We projected extreme poverty to go up by 90 million just in 2020. And this is a reversal from 1990 onwards. We've had trend declines in poverty, and now this could be the reversal. So we have our policy recommendations here. I'm not going to go into this in great detail, and I'm happy to discuss them. But obviously, there is no one size fits all, and every country has to deal with this. But first and foremost, this is a health crisis, which means that countries will have to prioritize health spending everywhere in the world. And the global community has to do a lot more to ensure that there is timely and widespread availability of any solution to this pandemic, be it a vaccine, be it better treatments, be it better testing. And unfortunately, I am worried that we are falling far short of that. Secondly, it's a priority to make sure that poorer households, highly vulnerable households, receive income support. And again, that's a minimum part of any agenda for any government, regardless, depending upon your fiscal situation, but that would be a priority. It's important to be able to support firms that are being directly hit because of the lockdowns. Also, in terms of strategies of dealing with the virus, more targeted lockdowns, much more widespread use of contact tracing and testing, all of that we know can play a very important role. Countries should also, of course, prepare for the future, and this is a time where governments can think about putting their economies on a recovery path which is more equitable, more sustainable, alongside being more prosperous. For instance, we have analytical work that shows you that public investment, high quality public investment, can not only create a large number of jobs and help have a job-rich recovery, but also they enhance productivity. If you do green investment, will help tremendously, of course, in preventing catastrophic climate change. We certainly don't want another major crisis of this kind coming up from nature. And at the same time, because of the fact that we live in an environment of very low interest rates and high uncertainty, that the multiplier or the effect of these kinds of investments on economic activity can be so large that it can actually be beneficial in reducing debt to GDP ratios over time. So again, prioritize health and education spending, income support to the poor. These are for regions that have more limited resources. Reduce wasteful spending and poorly targeted subsidies. Try to lock in low interest rates in these in the current environment that we have. But all countries will need a medium-term fiscal framework where, depending on the country's specific characteristics, it could involve greater progressivity in the tax system, much better effectiveness in tax collection, and also just make sure the corporate taxation actually works around the world. And then, and multinationally, the countries' corporations are actually paying their fair share of taxes. So with that, I will stop and hand it back to Jose and Roberto.
Thank you very much, Gita. Just to keep up with your last words on fiscal, because fiscal is quite at the key of all the future challenges and at the needs that are what we need today. So one thing that I was, if you can mention, how do you see at the fund, you see that the recovery will take very long, but the normalization of the social interactions, because that's quite important in terms of fiscal support and also on the recovery. And the other thing that also many emerging countries, especially low income, they need to have fiscal support, but they don't have enough funding. So how is now the fund also involved in helping countries to finance this transition fiscally?
I mean, indeed, Jose, this is the number one question, and this is a crisis where fiscal really is in some sense much more effective in dealing with this crisis. And so fiscal policy has to play a very important role. So to the question of, there are different buckets of countries. So there are emerging markets that enter this crisis with very good fundamentals, high investment grade countries. They're able to borrow on markets at very low rates, even lower rates than pre-pandemic, because of the fact that central banks everywhere have cut interest rates. So they're able to finance themselves. It is essential, of course, that we're able to maintain these forms of liquidity in the market, and there's not going to be and to avoid a situation like March where you had severe financial market turmoil. So that is going to be important for a bunch of countries. Then there are other countries for whom the debt levels entering this crisis were already too high, that they're not able to borrow at small spreads. They're borrowing at high rates. And there is a real concern about debt distress. So of course, a combination of steps will have to be needed. Concessional financing, aid, grants, debt service relief, all of this will have to play an important role. And at the IMF, for instance, we have provided emergency financing to over 75 countries, precisely for this purpose, which is to make sure that they have the resources to do necessary spending in terms of health, and necessary spending to help the poor and the vulnerable population. Typically IMF lending comes with programs, but this is not one of those cases. This is one of those cases which you have lending without the conditionalities, so that it can be deployed. It can be deployed quickly. Secondly, debt service relief is important. At the IMF, we have provided that to poorer members who owe debt to the IMF. And then you have the debt service suspension initiated by the G20, which provide debt service relief, but it's more of a moratorium for about a 12-month period. Now, I don't think that's going to be enough. Much more will be needed, and there will be countries that need outright debt restructuring. And that's something that the international community has to prepare for. And it has to be, it should have engagement from everybody. Paris Club members, non-Paris Club members, the private sector have to all be involved in that. But again, it is for the countries that do not have the resources or particularly struggling in providing the basic services to their people, the international community has to play a very important role. I'll stop with that.
Gita, thank you so much first for coming here and chatting with us about this important topic. So I have a question. So in the scenario that was constructed by the IMF, you probably were not anticipating the lockdowns that are happening in France and in Europe, and maybe conceivably what could happen in the United States with the cases that are going up so fast in many of the states right now and the whole country. So there is a risk that this could get worse. Is that correct?
So Roberto, what we have assumed is that because we still don't have a solution for the pandemic, we've assumed that social distancing will persist for a while now. Right?
Okay.
So the assumption was not that the assumption was that the fall would be one where there would be social distancing practice, either imposed by the government or voluntary. It would be the case. Now, what is the impact of that on economic activity? The assumption is that that's going to look more like what we saw in the summer in the US, as opposed to what we saw in the spring, right? So in the summer, we did see this big spike in cases, but we didn't, the hit to economic activity was more of a slowing a little bit, but actually mobility kept improving. Now, if that's not the case, and actually the hit starts looking more like what we saw in the spring as opposed to the summer, I think that's a real downside to our forecast.
There is something that is interesting is that in the wheel, in the
World Economic Outlook,
in the April wheel, now you have to, in the April wheel, the prospects were much worse than you have. Part is China, but also it seems that the effect on economic activity had been dramatic, but not as dramatic as they were expected in June. Now, my question is, there are many things that are going on. So I would like to know how you weigh the different things. For example, that the economies are much more able to work online and with social distancing than perhaps what we expected at the beginning of the year. Or the importance of policy support has been perhaps greater than what we thought at the beginning. And also perhaps a better control in the countries that are recovering of the pandemic. How you think that these factors are weighing on the not that bad outlook, still quite bad?
Yes. Forecasting is always a difficult thing to do, and this time it's it's difficulty cubed. Just to be clear about the projection, so we had in April the global economy is projected to shrink by -3%, and then we went using the new PPP weights. It goes down to we had -5.2, and now we're back to 4.4. Now, remember, the first big downgrade was a 6 percentage point downgrade. Everything else is in the ballpark of about 1 to 2%. What is going on here? Why did we have the upgrades? The upgrades come from the fact that in making these kinds of forecasts, we are using high frequency indicators. And the relationship between the high frequency indicators that you measure, like for instance, mobility, and actual economic activity seems to be changing over time. That relationship changes over time. And so for a bunch of countries, what we saw was that the second quarter of this year, though the mobility numbers were showing weaknesses, it was not the case in terms of actual economic activity. So there is a bit of a difference there. Second, we're also seeing that indeed it is the case that because people have become more familiar with this virus, that even as virus case counts go up, the hit to mobility is smaller than it was the first time around. So these are the kinds of factors that are leading to upgrades. Second, of course, fiscal policy announcements. They keep getting announced over time, and we can only incorporate them once they're announced. So that's another source of the the upgrade. For instance, in the case of Chile, the source of the upgrade was one part of the source of the upgrade was the ability for people to use their pension savings, and we know that that was withdrawn by about 6% of GDP. So that's a substantial stimulus, and so measures of that kind play an important role. But again, there is so much still that one doesn't know about the epidemiology of this particular virus, about how people will respond now to these further resurgence of cases, the exact timeline in terms of when a certainly effective vaccine will be available. I mean, there are many questions there. So we're doing this in the environment of very high levels of uncertainty.
I saw in your projections that this shock, the recovery, you're calling it long, but it could be a permanent shift in that that standards of living can be affected for a long, long time, which means that life of a generation, conceivably. So I want to ask a little bit about the social unrest that could cause, because you're highlighting two things. One, very long deterioration of standards of living, and the other one is a very uneven distribution of that pain. So are we thinking about which countries could be more vulnerable to these things? We had many Latin American countries at the end of 2019 that were experiencing social unrest. So we should be preparing ourselves for this. What do you think?
Given the fact that inequality is projected to rise, poverty is projected to go up, I can see a situation where in the future there would be greater social unrest. This, what we looked at some episodes of pandemics in the past, more epidemics and pandemics in the past, and you do see significant increases in inequality that persists 5 years out. At least you see that effect showing up. But at the same time, you actually see that there is, in the initial years, there's not been an increase in social unrest, because there is some sense of solidarity that's involved with everybody being involved in a very crisis like no other. But at the same time, if government policies and government response doesn't prevent these scars from growing, and doesn't ensure the most vulnerable people have access to their incomes and their and education and health, then there is the risk of social unrest. Absolutely.
No, and I think that you made in the presentation a very good point about the fiscal priorities, because it's given the increase in inequality and the problems that the health crisis is having on poor households, prioritizing health and education is quite reasonable at this stage in the crisis. There is another thing that is looking at the world economy is worrisome. For some, is good news. Well, depending on how you want to see, and it's somewhat of the link between asset prices and economic activity. So we have seen, for example, record numbers in the stock market in the US, and well, there is an explanation, very simple, due to the monetary stimulus. Now the issue is whether this could be maybe creating a bubble of mispricing that over time may create a collapse, financial problems, and deepen any recovery. So how do you see that?
So this disconnect between financial markets and the real economy is something that we flag in our global financial stability report, sector report. I'm sorry. What you see, what explains this? Of course, what you're seeing just in terms of an accounting is you see the fact that it's not just that interest rates have come down, but the premia that people are paying or receiving for very risky assets have just come down dramatically. The spreads have come down on many different asset classes, and this is what you should expect when you have central banks around the world, trying to prevent a financial catastrophe and provide the liquidity and that is needed in all of these different markets. So that's what you see. Now, of course, there's also, by the way, a big compositional effect, which is that you see it is what drives the stock market recovery, especially the upside end of it, are tech sectors, pharma sectors, and those are really very big players in driving this recovery. We have our assessment that there certainly seems like there is overheating happening in some of these sectors, and that corrections could be possible. Again, nobody's predicting anything at this point, but yes, there is absolutely a risk of financial conditions becoming unstable, which is why we've made the point. This is a point we've made from the past, which is that there needs to be much more closer macroprudential regulation more in terms of tracking at this point where the risks could be potentially building up. While it is important to keep monetary policy accommodative, you do need to worry about building up of financial risks. This is something that we flag.
Yeah, and I think that is quite from the perspective of Latin America, quite worrisome, is that in all what you show, Latin America is one of the regions that has been doing homogeneously very bad. Some countries a bit better than others, but there has been, and this is also linked to the problem that the health crisis has not evolved well in the region. We still have kind of stuck with high levels of cases and death compared to many other countries. We kind of reach the peak, but we stay with relatively high levels. How do you see the connection between the health crisis and the control of the crisis and the stringency and economic recovery rather than just the economic downturn?
Yeah, in the Latin America region, it has 88% of the world's population. It had about 28% of the world's cases and over 30% of the world's deaths. So certainly it's a region that has been disproportionately affected by this. In many countries, it was a very slow climb. It took a long time, and restrictions have had to stay in place for a very long time because of how gradual this process was. This is going to, of course, affect activity as long as this pandemic is with countries, as long as they're going to have to deal with a rising number of cases, or even if it is stabilized but at a high level, it is going to weigh on economic activity going forward. There are many parts of the world that have been more effective in, especially East Asia, that has been very effective. I mean, also China has been very effective in being able to control the pandemic, and that's worked well. And we know that measures like very heavy levels of testing and contact tracing, mask wearing, all of that on the margin help. Social distancing can help. But it's worked differentially in different places of the parts of the world. It's not. I don't think there's an easy, simple recipe for how to deal with it. But I think what is very important, this is a point I made earlier, which is it's quite clear that there are going to be treatments, there are going to be much better testing, much cheaper testing prospects, much faster testing prospects. Vaccines, we'll figure out how effective they are, but they're all going to be there in the near horizon. We just have to make sure that all of the world gets access to it at the scale that's required. But if you look at, production capacities relative to what the demand is, we're not there yet. And so I think even for the Latin American region and for every other region in the world, this is going to be a very important solution to make sure there's enough scale to get these treatments and tests and vaccines available everywhere.
And do you believe that when the vaccines are there, we will free the patents so we can manufacture that in every place on earth? I mean, like Latin America, for example, we have two good countries that produce vaccines, Argentina and Mexico, that have very high capacity to produce this type of vaccines. But we will need the patents to be freed somehow for these places to be manufacturing at a big scale, like every lab will be manufacturing. So do you think that we will get there, that we will have an agreement that whoever finds the drug, then we just release the patent?
Well, I hope that we can do whatever is necessary to make sure that there is enough production for the world, because no part of the world is safe unless all parts of it are safe. And so there is, you know, the steps absolutely have to be taken to make that available and make sure that there is enough production. You know, I think there are efforts being made. There is, you know, there are many. There's a COVAX initiative. There are many other kinds of initiatives that are happening, which is precisely trying to ensure that there's enough production of this to be available. I just worry that we're nowhere near the scale that's needed. And also, secondly, that this should not just be about vaccines, but also about, you know, in the meantime, you can have better treatments and testing, and those are getting ignored.
Yeah, I'm worried because, you know, this is a place where, you know, the IMF and developed nations could play a very important role. I mean, we could say to any lab, we will just pool all the developed nations resources. A small amount for developed nations will be $200 billion. Any lab will love to sell the patent at that, and then we just make it through the United Nations, through international organizations. We make the patent available to everybody and disclose them. So I am concerned that a little bit of these international organizations are a little bit about countries that are trying to protect the supply for themselves, and you have seen that a little bit in the US and in Europe. So that you know, that means that.
No, this is a point we've been making. So in fact, we actually.
No, I know. I imagine you have been making this, Gita.
I know. I don't write the checks, but the you know, the point that we've made is that relative to our baseline, if we can you know, if we can do one of the things that you said, which is make sure that there's enough scale of production made rapidly available everywhere, we're adding 9 trillion to the global economy between now and 2025. And it benefits both advanced economies and emerging economies and low-income countries. It benefits everybody. So there's absolutely a need for that. Now, of course, you know, this is more also in the scope of organizations like the WHO and the World Bank to do these kinds of things. But we have been stepping up and making the point how essential this is.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Yes, to not to take you longer, but there is an issue that in many countries and in Latin America is being discussed around the fiscal things and many of the questions and there are a lot of specific, and you say any country has to do a fiscal framework, credit fiscal framework within their needs and within their capabilities. But there is a big issue about raising taxes today and in order to start financing and many ideas about taxation. How do you see the timing rather than the specific? How do you see the timing of the tax increase that sooner or later will have to come in many countries in order to achieve fiscal consolidation?
I mean, as long as the pandemic is causing shutdowns and lockdowns, and we don't see a durable recovery, I think it would be destabilizing to have policies that end up with, you know, with kind of the stimulus goes in the wrong direction in some sense. And so I think what is important to have more of a medium-term framework. Again, what is exactly medium-term? I would say, you know, the 3 to 4 year window we're talking about here. But we have to, right now, and while there's still tremendous uncertainty, I think right now is the time to make sure that you're deploying the fiscal resources that you need, which is actually, you know, in terms of spending, making sure that there's income for people.
I want to be conscious of your time. You have been incredibly busy and incredibly grateful to give us this hour for all of us in Latin America. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing all these ideas. This is, I feel that we're in good hands. Gita, you have been there. I know that you're paying attention to all the issues that are important for the world, but also that you are not forgetting the emerging markets where we are all from. So thank you so much for all of that and for doing all this public good for the whole world. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for spending these hours with all of us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gita. It's been great, and well, you have a long tradition in emerging markets and studying, so it's not a surprise. This and many people are asking about the presentation we have in our webpage or presentation, and we can enjoy, and we can even repeat the session. So thank you very much, and do well.
Thank you. I hope to see you both at some point in person, hopefully.
Well, in person.
2021 at some point.
I'll see you in the world in the JAX conference. I'll be there.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.